Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm delighted to speak to you about a collector dear to my heart, Marjorie Merriweather Post, and her passion for France, with a focus on her interest in French interiors and the replication of the famous French drawing room, which you can see behind me, in many of her residences, culminating at Hillwood. So a little bit of background before we get started just about this fascinating woman. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born on March 15, 1887 in Springfield, Illinois. She was the only child of Charles William, known as C.W., and Ella Merriweather Post. Post's taste in collecting began as a young woman during the Gilded Age, spanning the glamorous 1920s in New York and Palm Beach, expanding to the role of diplomat as the wife of ambassador to Soviet Russia and Belgium in the late 1930s, and culminating as one of the most influential philanthropists and society hostesses in Washington, D.C. between the 1940s and 1960s. In 1895, C.W. Post established Postum Cereal Company in Battle Creek, Michigan, that would later become General Foods. As a result of the company's early success and the family's growing fortune, Marjorie Post and her father embarked on several trips to Europe, including multiple stays in Paris, where they visited the Universal Exhibition of 1900. These early travels most certainly influenced Marjorie's taste and aesthetic as a future collector, as well as a dedicated Francophile. C.W. Post was also an amateur collector of English and Italian genre paintings, antiquities, and natural gemstones. And here is an interior view of Post's art gallery located in his office building in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he often welcomed guests, as well as one of his Italian marble sculptures on the right. Trained to succeed her father, Marjorie Post continued her education at Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C. from 1901 to 1904, where she learned European and American history, art history, and music. In 1905, at the age of 18, Post married her first husband, Edward Bennett Close, and the couple resided in Greenwich, Connecticut. After her father's death in 1914, Marjorie Post, at the age of 27, inherited Postum Cereal Company along with $20 million, the equivalent to $526 million today, making her the wealthiest woman in America. In 1915, she moved to New York City with Close and her two eldest daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor, who you see on the left. The family initially acquired Burden Mansion on the corner of 92nd Street and Fifth Avenue, which was built in 1905 for the Iron Heir Isaiah Townsend Burden by the prominent American architect Horace Trumbauer, who built many palaces for wealthy robber barons of the Gilded Age and was decorated by Jules Allard, who was responsible for many of the villas in Newport. Beginning in the late teens and early 1920s, following acquisitions of old master paintings, 18th century British portraiture, and 17th century Flemish tapestries, Post worked with the interior design firm William Baumgarten and Company to update the interiors of Burden Mansion and supply some of her earliest acquisitions of 18th century French furniture, including a suite of 4 walnut armchairs covered in Beauvais tapestry, which I show you on the upper right, and a writing desk that you see highlighted in the photo after the well-known Bureau du Roi, made by the royal cabinet makers Aubin and Riesner and delivered to King Louis XV at Versailles in 1769. Copies of this iconic desk, like the one on the lower right, were reproduced by leading 19th and 20th century cabinet makers. Post would have seen additional works by Riesner and other 18th century masters during her travels to Versailles and the Louvre, likely under the guidance of British art dealer Sir Joseph Duveen, with whom Post became a client between 1919 and 1920. Throughout the later 1920s, Duveen developed relationships with other female clients, such as Anna Thompson Dodge and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, but Post was certainly one of the earliest. Her first acquisition of 18th century French furniture from Duveen for Burden Mansion was this small work and writing table with floral marquetry attributed to Adrienne Delorme, which you see on the right, from about 1770, that she placed in the French drawing room. The paneling, made in the 20th century, but in the 18th century style, was installed in the French drawing room at Burden Mansion, was already in place by the time Post moved in. But it was this early iteration of the decoration of the room that would have a lasting effect on many subsequent residences. I'm sure most of you are already familiar, but I thought I would just quickly define the term drawing room, which was derived from the 16th century with drawing room, where visitors were entertained and women literally withdrew for privacy after dinner. It's perhaps synonymous with today's living room. The term remained popular throughout the 18th century in England and France, and the word salon began to be used for the drawing room in the early part of the 19th century. And I'm sure some of you are already familiar with Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman's chapter entitled The Drawing Room, Boudoir, and Morning Room in the Manual of Interior Design, The Decoration of Houses, where Wharton defines the drawing room as both a public and private space and charts the development of the room and furniture. It was also for the French drawing room at Burden Mansion that Post acquired one of her most significant French royal portraits in 1922 from Wildenstein in New York, depicting Louise Elizabeth of France, Duchess of Parma, who was the eldest daughter of King Louis XV, with her daughter Isabel, who later married the Archduke Joseph II of Austria, painted by Jean-Marc Nattier during their visit to Fontainebleau in 1750 to meet the king. It was also during this period that Post developed a passion for French tapestries and acquired a set of 5 Beauvais tapestries, 3 of which are conserved at Hillwood today, depicting allegorical scenes from Les Amours des Dieux, after designs by François Boucher, including Bacchus and Ariadne and Jupiter and Antiope, completed in 1750. Post acquired the set of tapestries in 1919 from Duveen while redecorating Burden Mansion in the French 18th century style, following her divorce from her first husband, Edward Close, and pending her second marriage to financier Edward Francis Hutton. Following the demolition of Burden Mansion in 1924 and the development of a 14-story apartment building in its place on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 92nd Street, Post enlisted the decorating firm French & Company to help furnish this newly constructed sprawling residence and replicate many of the interiors and displays of the former mansion within a 54-room penthouse apartment on the top 3 floors, retaining a private entrance at 2 East 92nd Street. She knew that this apartment would be perceived as an important entree into New York society and used for entertaining during the fashionable and modern Roaring '20s. Beginning in 1927, Post purchased a number of pieces of antique furniture from the dealers, as well as commissioned reupholstery, repairing and refinishing, together with the cleaning of tapestries and the fabrication and hanging of shades and draperies for the windows in several rooms of the apartment. In 1928, French & Company completed the woodwork and paneling for the French drawing room, library, and dining room in New York, as well as supplied additional works of art for Post's Long Island country house, her summer residence in the Adirondack Mountains, her Palm Beach estate at Mar-a-Lago, and her private yacht. Post rented the apartment with E.F. Hutton until their divorce in 1935. However, she maintained the residence until 1941. They welcomed a daughter, Nadinia, the actress model known as Dina Merrill, in 1923. This was the era when Hutton served as chairman of the board of Postum Cereal Company, and the couple spent much of the Roaring '20s growing the vast empire that became General Foods in 1929. It was also during this period, under the continual guidance and tutelage of Duveen, that Post developed a more serious interest in 18th century French furniture and decorative arts. Thanks to dealers like Duveen, the taste for the French Ancien Régime was characteristic among a newly wealthy American elite. But it was also his compilation of instruction books in schools of painting and photo albums and gallery maps of French 18th century portraits at the Louvre and Versailles, which I show you here on the right, that prepared Post for her travels to Paris. Duveen and his wife were also present for the housewarming celebration Marjorie Post held on April 29, 1926, describing the interiors as, quote, a dream of delight, end quote, and, quote, fairyland, end quote. He went on to say, quote, I shall never forget when I entered the drawing room with my charming hostess greeting me, what an impression was conveyed to me. For although I had seen the room before, I had never seen it in the evening, or with the flowers, or with the exquisite lighting so soft and so discreet. I have been to many great events in my life all over the world, but I have never seen anything more refined and exquisite than last night. One of Post's acquisitions from Duveen for her new French drawing room was this mechanical ladies' writing and dressing table inlaid with floral and pastoral marquetry and stamped by the Paris cabinet maker Pierre Boischaud, who became master in 1769. Boischaud worked with the German-born royal cabinet maker Jean-François Euben, from whom Boischaud likely mastered the technique of mechanical furniture and style of marquetry. Due to the stylistic similarities related to a group of tables with sliding tops that are either signed or attributed to Euben, it is also possible that Boischaud may have finished some of Euben's pieces after his death in 1761. One of the more intriguing aspects of this dressing table is the presence of two interior typed labels referencing that it once belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette and was acquired in Paris from a certain Vacher in 1825 by the Reverend Philip Gray Egerton and brought to his residence at Olton Park. The Vachers were father and son dealers in Paris during the Restoration and Louis Philippe periods, who supplied the court with furniture and acquired during the Revolutionary sales. They may also have carried out alterations to 18th century works of art at the same time, perhaps inventing false royal associations. It was also in her new drawing room that Post hung her favorite Nattier double portrait of the Duchess of Parma and Isabel on the left, now juxtaposed with a portrait painted in 1929 by Giulio de Blas of Post and her own daughter, Nadine Hutton, a clear and intentional association with the French royal family. In the de Blas portrait, Post is wearing her impressive Mughal, emerald, and diamond Art Deco pendant brooch that she purchased from Cartier in New York in 1928 in advance of her presentation to the court of St. James the following year. For the 2021 exhibition Roaring Twenties, The Life and Style of Marjorie Merriweather Post at Hillwood, we created one wall of the French drawing room of Post's apartment, bringing back furniture that is no longer in the collection and making a film featuring the interiors of the apartment. Returning to furniture, another pivotal acquisition of 18th century furniture during this period was this impressive roll-top desk made by the German father and son cabinet makers Abraham and David Röntgen, decorated with the initials MA inlaid with mother of pearl, attributed today to the Bavarian princess Maria Antonia Walpurgis, Electress of Saxony. Post acquired the desk in 1927 from the New York branch of the London-based dealer Henry Simons and Company, at which time the initials were attributed to none other than Queen Marie Antoinette, from whom Röntgen received the title Ébéniste mécanicien du roi et de la reine. The desk decorated Post's Louis XVI style bedroom of her New York apartment, where she used it regularly. As she recounted to Versailles curator Gerald Vanderkempt in a letter from 1957, quote, "The beautiful desk of Marie Antoinette, which you know always lives in my own bedroom, and I use it every day," end quote. Vanderkempt, along with Louvre curator Pierre Verlet, visited Hillwood in 1961 and was particularly enthusiastic about Post's furniture collection. The desk's quality of pictorial marquetry, symbolizing the arts, music, and math and sciences, as well as the complexity of mechanical devices, are a testament to Röntgen's workshop. The inside of the desk houses an arrangement of compartments and fold-out devices, including 4 candle holders with snuffers and shades to protect from the heat and diffuse the light, an adjustable mirror on top that can be raised by a crank at the side, and secret buttons on the lower half to reveal additional compartments and lockable boxes with veneers on all sides. This 2-tiered support allows the desk to function both as a writing and dressing table and can be used while sitting or standing. Beginning in 1926, as a result of the formation of a significant collection of French decorative arts, Post began to assemble a private collection catalog, unfortunately never printed, with entries by several experts. The 1928 draft, which I show you on the screen, includes many of these early furniture acquisitions and essays on French furniture. The introduction, written by art critic Frank Jewett Mather, defined Post by writing, quote, "Only a collector of discriminating and fastidious taste could have gathered such examples of French ébénisterie," end quote. Here I show you a cutout photo of the Röntgen desk in the open position with Post's handwritten annotations, including dimensions, directions of opening compartments, and the name of the dealer, Simons. The final version of the catalog, compiled in 1937 and bound with a red leather cover and gold lettering, was likely never printed due to Post's departure overseas to Soviet Russia with Ambassador Davies that same year, followed by new acquisitions of Russian art and the onset of World War II. In addition to marquetry decoration, Marjorie Post, like many female collectors of the 20th century, had a passion for furniture inlaid with Sèvres porcelain plaques, including this important pair of jewel coffers made by Martin Carlin, similar to one acquired by Madame du Barry for the Chateau of Fontainebleau, that Post acquired from Duveen in 1926 and prominently installed in the French drawing room in New York on either side of the mirrored double doors, which I hope you can see here and here. In a letter to Duveen in February 1925, 1 year before she purchased the coffers, Post wrote, quote, "The pair of bleu Sèvres casquets de mariage are the most lovely things I have ever seen, and I would like to have a few months' time in which to digest their prices mentally. Would so much like to have them," end quote. One of the coffers is believed to have been owned by the Duchesse de Mazarin, and both coffers were previously in the collection of Alfred de Rothschild and decorated the green room of his Seymour Place residence in London in the 1880s, which you can see highlighted by red arrows here and here. Post's growing collection of 18th century French furniture with royal and aristocratic provenance coincided with her penchant for costume balls of the 1920s. She was photographed in her French drawing room in New York, dressed as Marie Antoinette, with one of the coffers in noticeable view shown here on the left. Several years later, Post gifted both coffers to her daughter, Eleanor Close Balsam, who subsequently donated them to Versailles in 1961, where they remain today. One of Post's Marie Antoinette costumes from Hillwood's collection was reunited with one of the jewel coffers in the Versailles Revival exhibition of 2019, seen here on the right. I was fortunate to be able to visit Madame du Barry's recently renovated private apartments at Versailles a few weeks ago, and was pleasantly surprised to see Marjorie Post's jewel coffer from the exhibition on prominent display. Perhaps Post's French drawing room served as a model for Anna Thompson Dodge's music room at Rose Terrace outside of Detroit, which was decorated by Duveen and the Parisian decorating firm à Lavoine a few years later in 1934, and incorporates similar Louis XVI white and gold paneling, Aubusson carpets, Boucher tapestries, and vitrines of Vincennes and Sèvres porcelain. The room also displayed a nearly identical late 18th century jewel coffer mounted with Sèvres porcelain plaques, previously in the collection of Empress Maria Fedorovna of Russia at Pavlovsk, acquired from Duveen in 1932. And here you can see Anna Thompson Dodge's similar Sèvres mounted coffre de bijoux. It is also hard not to compare the portrait of Anna Dodge as Madame de Pompadour on the left with the photograph of Marjorie Post dressed as Queen Marie Antoinette taken in Palm Beach a few years earlier. Not surprisingly, these fashionable 18th century aristocratic women remained very much in vogue in the 1920s and 30s by American collectors who imitated them at costume balls and coveted works of art connected to Versailles. Post and Dodge were neighbors on Ocean Boulevard in Palm Beach, and Dodge's daughter Delphine married the son of Eva Stotesbury, who was a close friend of Post. So it seems extremely likely that Dodge and Post were acquainted socially and embraced similar collecting interests. In addition to furniture, paintings, and tapestries, Post developed a passion for French porcelain from the Vincennes Sèvres porcelain manufactory, and these early displays in her bedroom in New York depict some of the first porcelain services she would subsequently use for display in the French drawing room at Hillwood. Marjorie Post also developed a passion for the fine craftsmanship and historic rituals associated with small luxury objects, including snuff, patch, and tobacco boxes, vanity cases, perfume bottles, and other luxury accessories made of precious gold, enamel, and gemstones. Many of these objects were used in the bathing and dressing ritual popularized in 18th century France, known as la toilette. It was also the enjoyment associated with holding, touching, opening, and the display of such objects and their contents that contributed to Post's enjoyment of collecting objects of this genre and part of a future display in the French drawing room at Hillwood. At Hillwood, post-final residence, she was able to combine her love of French furniture and decorative arts with her collection of Russian art, most of which she acquired while living in Soviet Russia with her third husband, Joseph Davies, who served as ambassador between 1937 and 1938. Following her divorce from Davies in 1955, Marjorie Post purchased the Neo-Georgian mansion and 25-acre property, then known as Abremont, built in 1927 for the Washingtonian Blodgett family. Between 1955 and 1957, Post commissioned the architect Alexander McIlvaine and interior decorators Macmillan and French and Company from New York to install antique paneling and design a sequence of rooms for entertaining and for the display of her collection. Post added a front and back portico, enlarged the entry hall, built a third story for staff rooms, and added a pavilion to the west side of the house for dancing and watching films. Here I show you a general timeline and craftsmen who worked at Hillwood. Post also re-landscaped the entire estate to include several new gardens, including a French parterre adjacent to the French drawing room, complete with French sculptures. She changed the name of the estate to Hillwood after her Long Island country house and decided early on that this final residence would one day become a museum. As the doyenne of Washington, D.C., and former wife of an ambassador, her collection played a vital role in entertaining her guests. Upon the arrival of her guests in the entry hall, which was meant to impress and evoke an 18th century European palace, complete with Russian imperial portraits and 18th century French furniture and paintings, Post welcomed guests for a drink before dinner in the French drawing room. A similar design format to the New York apartment, this space was used for entertaining, and some of Hillwood's most important pieces of 18th century French furniture decorate this room. The French drawing room is also one of two rooms at Hillwood that incorporate 18th century French paneling, this particular set from the Chateau de Bethencourtel on the Ile-de-France, supplied by French and Company between 1955 and 1957. Sadly, not much is known about this chateau or its interiors. So if anyone has any additional information or has heard of this particular chateau, please, I would be most interested to hear your opinion. Post's relationship with the firm French and Company began in New York in the 1920s and continued until the late 1960s, when she developed a close rapport and ongoing communication with Mitchell and brother Milton Samuels to help shape her collection and acquire several pieces of French furniture and porcelain for Hillwood. The design of the room and the installation of the paneling was a costly undertaking, and in a letter from Mitchell Samuels to Marjorie Post in August 1955, Samuels justified these costs in response to Post's inquiry. Quote, "I have very carefully gone into the estimate on the drawing room. It's a very big job, and our estimate includes everything: the necessary hardware, fixing up the old parts of the room, and fabricating the new parts in the best possible manner to conform with the old examples. I would invite the architects to get a competing bid, and I'm sure no one else can do it any cheaper," end quote. One of the reasons the installation of the paneling was so costly, as it had to be adjusted to fit into the existing dimensions of the room. While some panels were inevitably cut down, Marjorie Post decided to raise the height of the ceiling of the room in order to accommodate the ensemble. And you will notice this when you visit the second floor of Hillwood today, that there is a small staircase that was added during the renovation in order to enter Post's bedroom, which is just above the French drawing room. It is likely that the antique paneling and decoration for Post's drawing room was inspired by the 18th century furnishings of Musée Commandot and Jacques Marandré in Paris that she would have visited during her travels. In 1962, Magazine Antiques published an article on Marjorie Post Hillwood entitled "Living with Antiques" and featured a full-page color photo of the French drawing room while describing the Boucher tapestries and furnishings. As plans for a future museum took shape during the 1960s, Post decided to move important earlier acquisitions like this Röntgen roll-top desk that we looked at earlier from her bedroom at Hillwood into the French drawing room for prominent display on one end of the room between two windows, where she enjoyed revealing the secret drawers and mechanical devices for her guests, as you see in the photo on the left. During the renovation of Hillwood, Post lent the Röntgen desk to Versailles to be featured in the Marie Antoinette exhibition of 1955, organized on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the Queen's birth. And here you see the desk installed during this exhibition in 1955 at Versailles. To replace the Röntgen desk, Post acquired a second 18th century roll-top desk for her bedroom at Hillwood from Macmillan in 1965, believed to be from the Commando collection. The desk is marked by Konrad Motor, the German-born cabinet maker to the Comte d'Artois, who is known for his rich mahogany veneer and lavish gilt bronze decoration. The gilt bronze helmeted figures and the prominent sprays of laurel leaves suggest that the desk was intended for someone with a distinguished military career or for a member of the royal family who held a high military honorary rank. The drawing room was also where Post displayed her second important acquisition of French royal portraiture, depicting Empress Eugénie by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, dated 1857, in its original 19th century frame, purchased in 1952 from French & Company, as well as her growing collection of Sèvres porcelain, such as this wonderful Rococo vase designed by Jean-Claude Duplessis, whose vibrant pastel enamels echo the colors of the French paintings. Post hung the portrait of Empress Eugénie within a panel framed by gilt bronze garlands and swags above a marble mantelpiece believed to come from the Parisian residence of French socialite and Proust's muse, the Comtesse de Greffulhe, and surrounded by two tall vitrines of pink and blue Vincennes and Sèvres porcelain, as well as a group of mounted Asian and European porcelains, like these three examples that combine Chinese, French, and Meissen porcelain commissioned by the great Marchand Mercier in Paris, who helped create a new luxury market in the mid-18th century. Post also showcased additional important pieces of Bleu Celeste, Vincennes, and Sèvres porcelain from her collection opposite the French drawing room in the French porcelain room, combining pieces for the table and display. Post herself assisted with the design of many of these porcelain display vitrines, complete with pull-out drawers below for text, identifying key objects for visitors and school groups, an early indication that the collection was intended to be shared. In 1958, Post hired art scholar Marvin Ross as curator of collections. Ross had museum experience at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. He had also been a member of the advisory committee at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. Ross cataloged Post's collections, advised her on acquisitions, and implemented standard museum practices. He also expanded the library, lectured on the collection, and trained a group of Post friends to serve as docents when Hillwood was regularly open to the public in the mid-1960s. On the left, I show you one such demonstration for which Ross is presenting pieces of 18th century French furniture in the French drawing room to students and guests. And on the right is a letter from Ross to Post recounting French furniture expert Ted Dell's future visit to Hillwood in 1967 to examine objects in the collection. Opening the collection to students and scholars was part of the regular activity at Hillwood, and Post often led many of these visits herself. During the 1950s, Marjorie Post's daughter and collector Eleanor Close Balsam acquired several pieces of 18th century furniture, clocks, and porcelain for Hillwood's French drawing room on the art market in Paris while residing on the fashionable Rue de Monceau. One of Eleanor's more important royal acquisitions was this gilt wood dressing table chair, marked by Claude Senet with the inventory number 467 and branded with the stamp of the Garde-Meuble de la Reine, the personal furniture repository of Queen Marie Antoinette established in 1784. Senet was a member of an important Parisian family of menuisiers who worked for the crown, and it is believed that he supplied this chair for the Queen's cabinet de toilette, or dressing room, at the Château de Saint-Cloud. His son, Jean-Baptiste Claude Senet, supplied additional furniture for this room, including a daybed, 4 armchairs, stool, and fire screen, pieces of which are conserved today in the Reitzman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I show you on the right. A swivel chair of this model would have likely served a dual purpose, both as a desk and dressing table chair for such an intimate setting, and Post used it to sit at the Röntgen roll-top desk in the French drawing room, which you see a photo of on the left, which we looked at earlier. Another piece Post acquired in Paris through Eleanor, perhaps to replace the 2 porcelain-mounted coffers donated to Versailles, was this French jewel cabinet decorated with an unusual combination of Rococo mounts in geometric parquetry. Given Marjorie Post's passion for an extensive collection of jewelry, it is no wonder that she was attracted to such a model in which the plain veneered interiors accommodated the storage of cases of jewels. Post also developed an interest in multi-purpose furniture, often made and used by women, whether small chiffonier or mechanical dressing tables and desks, and likely would have enjoyed the ability to remove the top of the coffer for easy transport and use of the surface and pull-out drawer below for writing. In letters to Marjorie Post during this period, Eleanor wrote from Paris, quote, "Dearest mother, I am so terribly pleased that you like all the things bought here. About your coffre de bijoux, it belonged to the king and came down through the royal family. It really is magnificent. I know that you are going to be thrilled when you see the marriage jewel chest. No museum in any country has its equal," end quote. It is telling that Eleanor is already comparing Post's collection to other museums, perhaps foreshadowing plans for a future public bequest. And here you can see the jewel cabinet just over here to the left, beneath one of the Boucher tapestries, amidst the Nattier portrait, which is above the Röntgen roll-top desk, and the Senet swivel chair just next to it. Marjorie Post acquired this suite of furniture covered in Gobelin tapestry from French & Company for Hillwood's French drawing room in 1955, likely to replace some of the earlier upholstered suites from New York that we looked at earlier. The tapestries were ordered by Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from the Gobelin factory in 1784 and completed in 1785. They were intended for the Prince Henry of Prussia, brother of Frederick the Great, who visited Paris in 1784 and were part of the diplomatic gifts presented to him on that occasion. The gifts were taken to Berlin by Prince Henry, and some remained as part of the crown property. The Gobelin tapestries for the 2 sofas and 12 chairs are not recorded among the crown properties after the death of Prince Henry of Prussia, and were next recorded as belonging to King Leopold of Belgium. According to French & Company's stock sheet, chairs from this set were used by Their Majesties King George VI and Queen Elizabeth for a reception held at the World's Fair in New York in 1939, for which the decorating firm provided the furnishings. I can only imagine how Post's original attraction to this suite, given the association with the courts of France and Prussia, must have been amplified by the subsequent association with the British royal family. Post lent 2 armchairs and 1 sofa from this suite to the inaugural exhibition, The Taste of Connoisseurs, organized by French & Company from October 7 to the 25th, 1958. The photo on the left shows Consuelo Vanderbilt Balzan, another prominent lender to the exhibition, standing in front of 2 chairs from this same suite. Perhaps Vanderbilt also owned pieces from this suite at her Parisian townhouse, her chateau in Normandy, or her duplex apartment in New York. It is likely these 2 Francophiles and collectors may have crossed paths in New York, Palm Beach, or overseas. Juxtaposing both women amongst their French paneled interiors, standing in front of the same chairs and captured by the same photographer for Vogue suggests that Vanderbilt perhaps served as a collecting model for Post. Marjorie Post also collected French 18th century sculpture, both for her New York apartment and at Hillwood, including a marble bust of Marie-Anne de Mailly-Nesle, Duchess of Châteauroux, shown at the upper left, who was the mistress of King Louis XV from 1742 to 44, and several small marble busts and terracottas of Venus and Cupid and Bacchanalian groups, many after Falconet, and published in her collection catalogs of the late 1920s, which you see some photos of below. Post enjoyed placing many of these busts and small sculptures on top of mantels and furniture in the French drawing room, as is still the case today. Post continued to collect 18th century snuff boxes, pocket watches, perfume bottles, and objets de vertu, and displayed her collection in 2 18th century style vitrines in the French drawing room. Between 1939 and 1958, Marjorie Post was decorated by several foreign governments, including France, receiving the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur on August 7, 1957, for her efforts to construct field hospitals during World War I. In 1968, Post officially offered Hillwood to the Smithsonian Institution, retaining a lifetime interest. In the event that the Smithsonian could not accept the bequest, which ultimately it did not, The will authorized Hillwood to be transferred to the Marjorie Meriwether Post Foundation of Washington, D.C., established to operate Hillwood and Post's other properties. As a philanthropist, collector, and businesswoman, Post possessed a definitive vision for her art collection and final residence at Hillwood in Washington, D.C. as a public museum following her death in 1973, ultimately opening to the public in 1977. In 1962, she reminisced on her impending decision to make her house and collection public. And I put this quote on the screen for you to read at the same time. Quote, "I want young Americans to see how someone lived in the 20th century and how this person could collect works of art the way I have. I want to share this with the rest of the world. Maybe it'll be an incentive to some people, maybe it won't, but at least they'll get a chance to see how I lived," end quote. Marjorie Meriwether Post is part of an influential group of American women collectors and patrons, including Isabella Stewart Gardner, Mona von Bismarck, Peggy Guggenheim, and Doris Duke, among others, who played a key role in collecting and patronage and serves as an example for present-day historic house and collector museums. Her lifelong passion for French art and culture was exemplified through her houses, interiors, art collection, and fashion, and was also passed down to her daughters. Her decisive and early vision for Hillwood and her collection as a future museum in its original setting, as well as the resources she left in trust for future generations, resulted in Hillwood's legacy today. Thank you very much.